He was seconds away from signing his own betrayal, and the only person who noticed was the girl no one saw. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. Now, back to Elena Carter. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she carried the tray of crystal glasses across the marble floor, the soft glow of chandelier light reflecting off polished surfaces that cost more than her entire childhood home. She had learned quickly in places like this: move quietly, speak only when spoken to, and above all, remain invisible. Invisibility meant safety. Invisibility meant survival. And tonight, more than ever, she needed both. The private dining room at Russo's was filled with low voices and tailored suits, the kind of room where power didn't need to announce itself. It simply existed. At the center of it all sat Adrian Russo, a man whose presence shifted the air without a single word. He didn't raise his voice, didn't demand attention, yet every movement around him seemed to orbit his quiet authority. Elena kept her eyes down as she approached, but she could feel it, that weight, that stillness, like standing near something vast and immovable. Wine, the translator said smoothly, not even glancing at her, his voice gliding between English and Italian with effortless precision. Elena nodded and began pouring, her movements practiced, controlled. But as she leaned in slightly, something caught her attention. Not the words themselves, but the rhythm. The translator spoke fluently, confidently, yet something beneath the surface felt off. One word lingered longer than it should have. One phrase didn't quite align. Elena's grip tightened around the bottle, just for a second. She told herself to ignore it. This wasn't her place. These weren't her people. But then the translator continued, and this time, she heard it clearly. A single word, subtle, almost invisible, shifted the meaning entirely. It was the difference between partnership and control, between agreement and surrender. Elena's breath caught in her throat. No, that wasn't a mistake. That was deliberate. Her heart began to pound, loud enough she was certain someone would notice. She stepped back slightly, forcing herself to breathe, to focus. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe it was nothing. But then Adrian reached for the pen. The room seemed to tighten around that small, simple movement. The contract lay open. In front of him, thick paper, clean lines, a future written in ink waiting to happen. The translator smiled faintly, his posture relaxed, confident. Too confident. Elena felt something cold settle in her chest. She had heard this before. Years ago, in a smaller room, with a different man standing exactly where Adrian sat now. Her father. He had trusted the wrong translation. And everything that followed had been quiet, final, irreversible. Elena swallowed hard, her vision narrowing as the memory pressed against her. She had promised herself she would never get involved again. Never speak. Never risk it. Because people like her didn't get second chances. Adrian lifted the pen. The tip hovered just above the paper. Seconds. That's all it would take. Seconds to turn a conversation into something permanent. Elena's fingers curled slightly at her sides. Walk away, she told herself. This isn't your problem. Stay invisible. But her feet didn't move. Her eyes lifted, just barely, meeting the translators for the first time. And in that moment, she saw it. Not confidence, not professionalism, but calculation, precision, intent. He knew exactly what he was doing. Elena's heart slammed against her ribs. And suddenly, staying silent felt heavier than speaking. The room held its breath without realizing it. The soft hum of conversation faded into something thinner, sharper. Adrian's hand remained steady, the pen still hovering. Elena took a step forward before she even realized she had moved. Her voice came out softer than she expected, almost a whisper, but it cut through the room like glass. Stop, he's lying. The words hung there, suspended in the air, fragile and dangerous all at once. Adrian's hand froze mid-motion. The translator's smile didn't disappear, but something behind it shifted. Slowly, deliberately, Adrian lifted his gaze. And for the first time, he looked directly at her. Really looked. Not as staff, not as background, but as someone who had just stepped into a line no one crossed. The room went completely silent. Elena could feel every eye on her now, the weight of attention pressing down, threatening to crush the breath from her lungs. She should have been afraid. She was afraid, but she didn't look away. Adrian's voice, when it came, was quiet, controlled, Repeat that. Elena felt the silence press against her chest as if the air itself had weight, her pulse loud in her ears, but Adrian Russo's eyes never left her face, not blinking, not softening, simply waiting, measuring, calculating. And in that stillness she understood something that most people in that room never would, that his quiet was not patience, it was power, the kind that did not need to shout to be obeyed. And yet her voice, when it came again, was steadier than she expected, almost surprising even herself. He changed the structure of the sentence. She said carefully, each word placed with intention, the original. Phrasing implies mutual authority, but the way he translated it gives them unilateral control. The translator let out a soft, dismissive laugh, shaking his head as if amused by a child interrupting a conversation she could not possibly understand. With respect, he said smoothly, turning slightly toward Adrian. She is misunderstanding a regional nuance. His tone was polite, professional, perfectly composed. But Elena did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Adrian because instinct told her that he was the only one who mattered, the only one who would decide whether her words lived or died in this room. It is not a nuance, she replied quietly. It is a substitution. The translator's smile tightened, just barely, a flicker that might have gone unnoticed by anyone who was not looking for it. But Elena saw it, and Adrian saw it too, because something in his posture shifted, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to react, but enough to change the energy in the room, the kind of shift that made conversation slow and attention sharpen without anyone being told to do so. Explain, Adrian said, his voice low and even. And this time it was not a request. Elena inhaled slowly, grounding herself, because now there was no stepping back, no returning to invisibility. She had crossed that line the moment she spoke. The phrase he used, she continued, translates literally to, final authority rests with them. But the original wording is conditional. It requires both parties to agree before any decision is enforced. She paused for a fraction of a second, letting the weight of that difference settle. That is not interpretation, that is intent. A murmur almost formed at the edge of the room, but never fully surfaced, because no one dared to break the silence that had taken hold. The translator's expression remained composed, but there was a sharpness now, a tension, beneath the surface that had not been there before. You are making a serious accusation, he said, still calm, still controlled, but no longer relaxed. Elena nodded slightly, her hands no longer trembling. I am stating a fact, she said. And then, without waiting for permission, she reached for the document on the table, careful, deliberate, not touching anything she should not, only pointing. Here, she said, her finger hovering just above a line of text. This word. Adrian's gaze dropped to where she indicated, his focus narrowing. The translator stepped forward slightly. That is unnecessary, he said, but Adrian lifted one finger, a small, effortless gesture that stopped him instantly. No raised voice, no command, just a signal, and the translator fell silent. Elena continued, her voice gaining strength as clarity replaced fear. In Sicilian dialect, that term has two accepted meanings depending on context. One implies shared governance, the other implies surrender of authority. He chose the second. She looked up again, meeting Adrian's eyes, and he did not have to. The room seemed to contract around those words, tighter, quieter, more dangerous in its stillness. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, the pen now resting on the table, forgotten for the moment, his expression unreadable, but his attention absolute. Where did you learn that? He asked, and this question was different. Not skeptical, not dismissive, but precise, as if he was testing not just her knowledge, but the source of it. Elena hesitated for the briefest moment, not because she did not know the answer, but because she understood what revealing it meant. It meant stepping fully into the light, leaving behind the safety of being overlooked. But the truth had already begun, and there was no way to contain it now. My father was a translator, she said quietly. He taught me that words are never just words. Something in Adrian's expression shifted again, subtle, almost imperceptible, but real, as if that answer carried weight beyond its simplicity. The translator straightened, regaining some of his composure. With all due respect, this is highly inappropriate, he said, his tone firmer now, less polished. We are in the middle of a negotiation, not a language lesson. But Adrian did not look at him. Not yet. His gaze remained on Elena, steady, searching, and then he spoke. Not to her, but to the translator. Translated again, the words were calm, but they landed with finality, like a door closing. The translator hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But in a room like this, hesitation was louder than any confession, and Elena felt it. That shift, that crack in the surface that had been so carefully maintained. And in that moment, she understood that this was no longer about whether she would be believed. It was about what would happen next when the truth refused to stay hidden, and Adrian Russo, for the first time since she had entered the room, did not reach for the pen. The translator adjusted his cufflinks slowly, buying himself time, but the room had already turned against him in a way that could not be undone, not with words, not with confidence, not even with the polished tone he had relied on moments before, because hesitation had entered the space, and once it did, it spread like a quiet crack through glass, impossible to ignore once seen, and Adrian Russo noticed everything, especially what others tried to hide. Translated again, Adrian repeated, this time even softer, which somehow made it more absolute, the kind of command that did not need force because it carried certainty. The translator cleared his throat and began again, his voice still smooth but no longer effortless, the rhythm slightly off, the pauses a fraction too long, and Elena felt it immediately, that same imbalance, that same shift in meaning disguised as language. Only now it was more careful, more cautious, as if he were trying to correct something without admitting there had ever been anything wrong. He is altering it again, Elena said quietly, not interrupting, simply stating, and Adrian's eyes flicked back to her, sharp, attentive. How? He asked, and she stepped closer to the table, no longer hovering at the edge of the room, but standing within it, within the conversation, within the risk. He replaced the verb, she said, her voice steady. The original implies mutual consent before execution, but he is using a form that implies obligation regardless of agreement. The translator exhaled slowly, a controlled breath. This is becoming unnecessary, he said, his composure thinning at the edges. These distinctions are irrelevant in practical terms, but Adrian did not look at him, not yet. His attention remained fixed on Elena, as if she were the only source of clarity. In a room that had suddenly become uncertain, nothing is irrelevant, Adrian said calmly. And then, after a brief pause that seemed to stretch longer than it should, he added, especially not intent. The words settled heavily, and for the first time, the other men at the table shifted in their seats, subtle movements, exchanged glances, the quiet recognition that something had changed, that this was no longer a routine negotiation. Elena felt her heartbeat slow, not because the danger had passed, but because something else had taken its place, something steadier, sharper, the clarity of knowing she was right. There is more, she said, before she could stop herself, and the room stilled again. Adrian's gaze did not waver. Say it, he replied, and Elena pointed again, this time further down the page. This clause, she said. It looks standard, but it is not. Her finger hovered above the text, careful not to touch. It says disputes will be resolved by a neutral party, but the wording allows that party to be selected unilaterally. She looked up, meeting Adrian's eyes directly. By them, the translator's jaw tightened, just slightly. A reaction so small it might have been missed by anyone not watching for it. But Adrian saw it, and this time, he turned his head, slowly, deliberately, toward the translator, and when he spoke, his voice was no longer questioning. Why would that be acceptable? The question hung in the air, not loud, not aggressive, but precise, the kind of question that demanded an answer without raising its volume. The translator hesitated again, and this time the hesitation lingered a second too long. It is a common structure in international agreements, he said, but the confidence was thinner now, stretched, less convincing. Elena felt it before she even processed it, the subtle unraveling, the way certainty gave way to explanation, and explanation gave way to justification, and that was when the balance shifted completely. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, but his presence heavier now, more focused, common. he repeated, almost to himself, as if testing the word. Then he looked back at Elena. And you are certain? Elena did not hesitate this time. Yes, she said, simply, clearly, without embellishment, because truth did not need decoration, and something in that answer settled into the room like a final piece falling into place. Adrian nodded once. A small, almost imperceptible motion, but it carried weight, recognition, decision, and then he did something that no one at the table expected. He closed the contract, not forcefully, not dramatically, just a quiet, deliberate motion that ended the moment before it could continue. The pen remained untouched, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with the understanding that something significant had just been avoided, something that had almost happened but did not. Because one person chose to speak when she was supposed to remain silent. Adrian's gaze shifted once more, back to Elena. And this time, there was something different in it. Not just attention, not just calculation, but recognition, the kind that changes how a person is seen. You said your father was a translator, he said, his voice quieter now, less formal, and Elena nodded. Yes, she replied. And Adrian held her gaze for a moment longer before speaking again. And he taught you to listen. Carefully. It was not a question, and Elena's answer was just as steady. He taught me that the most dangerous lies are the ones that sound correct. The room went still again. But this time it was not tension, it was realization. And in that moment, Adrian Russo understood something he had not expected to learn that night. That power did not always sit at the head of the table. Sometimes, it stood quietly beside it, waiting to be noticed, and when it finally was, everything changed. No one spoke for several seconds. And in that silence, the truth did not need to be repeated. It simply existed, heavy and undeniable, settling into every corner of the room like a presence that refused to be ignored. The kind of silence that does not come from confusion, but from realization, and Adrian Russo let it linger, because he understood something most men in power often forgot. That silence could reveal more than any argument ever could. His fingers rested lightly against the closed contract, not gripping it, not claiming it, simply acknowledging it as something that no longer held the same authority it had moments before. And when he finally shifted his gaze back to the translator, it was not with anger, not with accusation, but with something far more controlled, something far more dangerous in its precision. You chose your words carefully, Adrian said, his voice even, measured, and the translator straightened slightly, as if trying to regain ground that had already slipped away. Of course, he replied. That is my profession. But the confidence did not land the way it had earlier. It felt rehearsed now, thinner, as if the structure behind it had weakened. Adrian nodded once, slowly, as if considering the statement. Then he leaned forward just enough to close the distance between them. Not aggressively, not forcefully, but intentionally. And yet, he continued, those choices would have bound me to terms I did not agree to. The translator opened his mouth to respond, but no words came immediately, and that pause, brief as it was, spoke louder than any explanation could have. Elena stood still beside the table, her hands now resting at her sides, no longer trembling. But she could feel every heartbeat in her chest, not from fear anymore, but from the weight of what was unfolding, the kind of moment that does not happen often, when truth interrupts power and forces it to reconsider itself. One of the men seated further down the table shifted slightly, clearing his throat. Perhaps this is simply a misunderstanding, he offered carefully, his tone diplomatic, cautious, but Adrian did not look at him. His attention remained fixed on the translator. Perhaps, Adrian repeated, and then, after a pause that stretched just long enough to make the word lose its comfort, he added, or perhaps it is not. The room tightened again, not with chaos, but with focus, as if every person present understood that the conversation had crossed into something deeper than negotiation, something closer to exposure. The translator adjusted his stance, his posture more rigid now, less fluid. I assure you, he said, there was no intent to mislead. But Elena noticed it again, that subtle shift in tone, the careful selection of words, not denying the action, only the intent, and that distinction mattered. Adrian noticed it too, because his expression did not change, but his stillness deepened. Intent is difficult to prove, Adrian said quietly, but outcomes are not. He let the words sit there, not as an accusation, but as a statement, something factual, something grounded, and then he reached for the contract again, not to sign it, but to turn it slightly, angling it toward the others at the table. "Read this," he said, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable authority. One of the men leaned forward, scanning the text, his brow tightening as he followed the lines Elena had pointed out, and then another leaned in, and another, until the document was no longer just between Adrian and the translator, but shared, examined, questioned, and with each passing second, the shift became more visible, more tangible. The quiet understanding that something had been hidden in plain sight, and now that it had been revealed, it could not be unseen. Elena remained where she was, not stepping forward, not retreating, simply present, her role no longer defined by the tray she had carried, but by the words she had spoken, and Adrian noticed that too, because when he finally spoke again, his voice carried something new, not warmth, not softness, but recognition. "You prevented a mistake," he said, and the room fell still once more, not because of the words themselves, but because of who they were directed toward. Elena met his gaze. Steady, composed. "I corrected a translation," she replied quietly, and Adrian's eyes held hers for a moment longer, as if measuring the difference between those two statements, as if understanding that what she had done was more than technical. It was a choice, a decision to speak when silence would have been safer. And then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxing just enough to signal that the moment of tension had passed, but not the impact of it. "We will review the terms again," he said, his voice returning to its earlier calm, but carrying a new clarity, without interpretation. The translator nodded stiffly, his composure intact on the surface, but something beneath it had shifted, something that could not be fully restored. And as the room began to move again, quiet conversations resuming, chairs adjusting, glasses being lifted, the energy was different now, altered in a way that could not be reversed, and Elena stood there for a brief second longer before turning slightly, preparing to step back into the role she had always known, the role that kept her unseen. But before she could take that step, Adrian spoke again, just one word, "Stay." And she froze, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because that word did not belong to the moment that had just passed. It belonged to something that was about to begin. Elena did not move immediately after he spoke, not because she did not understand the command, but because she did, and that was exactly what made it difficult, because stay did not mean the same thing anymore. It was no longer a simple instruction directed at staff. It was something else now, something that carried weight, attention, consequence. And for a brief moment, she felt the old instinct rise again, the one that told her to step back, to disappear, to return to the safety of being overlooked. But that instinct had already been broken the moment she chose to speak, and there was no returning to it now. So she remained where she was, her posture straight, her hands still, her eyes steady even as the room slowly resumed its quiet motion around her. Glasses lifted, chairs adjusted, voices returning in low tones that never quite reached their previous ease, because something had shifted, something that could not be undone. Adrian watched her for a moment longer before turning his attention back to the table, but not to the contract, not to the translator. Instead, he reached for a glass of water, a small, controlled movement that somehow rebalanced the entire room, as if signaling that whatever had just happened was not chaos, but correction. "We will proceed," he said calmly, and the words settled into place with quiet authority, not rushed, not forced, simply decided. One of the men across from him nodded, though his eyes flickered briefly toward Elena, as if reassessing her presence in a way he had not considered before. The translator remained standing where he was, his expression composed, but the ease had not returned, and Elena noticed that too, because once you learned to listen beyond words, you heard everything differently. Adrian set the glass down with a soft, controlled motion, then leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze shifting once more, not to the translator this time, but to Elena. "You said your father was a translator," he repeated, his tone quieter now, less formal, as if the conversation had moved beyond the surface. Elena nodded. "Yes," she replied, and Adrian studied her for a brief second, not as one studies an object, but as one studies a decision, something that carries meaning beyond its appearance. And he taught you to recognize intent, Adrian said, and Elena's answer came without hesitation. He taught me that words are chosen for a reason, she said, and when the wrong word is used, it is never accidental. The room grew still again, but this time it was not tension, it was attention, the kind that listens, that absorbs, that understands. Adrian nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something for himself. Then he turned his gaze back toward the translator. We will continue, he said, his voice even. But you will translate exactly what is said, nothing more, nothing less. The translator inclined his head, a controlled acknowledgement, but the authority had shifted now. It no longer sat with him. It had moved, quietly, decisively, and Elena felt it, not as power, but as clarity, the kind that comes when truth has been recognized. The discussion resumed, but it was different now, slower, more deliberate, every word weighed, every phrase examined, and Elena remained where she was, no longer moving between tables, no longer invisible, but present, observing, listening, her role undefined but undeniable. And as the minutes passed, she began to notice something else, something subtle but important. The translator was no longer leading the conversation. He was following it, carefully, cautiously, as if aware that every word now carried consequence. And Adrian, for his part, said very little, but when he did, the room listened, not out of obligation, but because his words now carried a sharper precision, a clarity that had been reinforced by what had just occurred. And then, after what felt like both a moment and an hour, Adrian placed his hand lightly on the table, a small gesture that immediately brought the conversation to a stop. No raised voice, no signal, just presence, and the room responded, as it always did. That will be all for tonight, he said calmly, and the finality in his tone left no room for discussion. Chairs shifted, papers were gathered, quiet acknowledgments exchanged, and one by one, the men at the table began to rise. The negotiation concluded, but not in the way anyone had expected when the evening began. The translator was the last to move, his posture still composed, but his silence louder now than his earlier confidence had been. He inclined his head once more toward Adrian, then turned and walked away without another word. And as the door closed softly behind him, the room seemed to exhale, the tension dissolving into something quieter, something more reflective. Adrian remained seated for a moment longer, his gaze resting on the now closed contract. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward Elena again, and this time, there was no distance in his attention, no separation of roles, no illusion of hierarchy, just recognition, clear and direct. What is your name? He asked, not as a formality, but as a question that mattered. And Elena, for the first time since entering the room, did not feel like she needed to lower her voice. Elena Carter, she said, steady, and Adrian repeated it once, quietly, as if committing it to memory. Elena. And in that moment, something settled between them, not spoken, not defined, but understood, because that night had already changed more than the outcome of a contract. It had changed who was seen, and who was no longer invisible. Elena remained where she stood even after the room had emptied. The silence now different from before, no longer heavy with tension, but filled with something quieter, something that lingered like a question waiting to be answered. The chandelier light above cast a soft glow across the polished table, reflecting off the untouched glassware and the closed contract that still rested at its center, and for a moment, everything felt suspended, as if time itself had slowed to acknowledge what had just taken place. Adrian Russo did not rush to leave. He remained seated, his posture relaxed but his presence unchanged, still commanding, still precise. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried none of the authority he had used moments earlier, but something more measured, more deliberate. You should not have spoken, he said, not as a reprimand, but as a statement of fact. And Elena understood immediately what he meant, not that she was wrong, but that she had taken a risk, one that people in her position were not expected to take. She held his gaze, steady. I know, she replied quietly, and Adrian studied her for a brief moment, as if weighing not her words, but the choice behind them. Then why did you? He asked, and this question was different from the others, not testing her knowledge, but seeking her reason. Elena hesitated, not because she did not know the answer, but because the truth was not simple. It was layered, shaped by memory, by loss, by something that could not be explained in a single sentence. But she spoke anyway, because she had already crossed the line once, and there was no reason to retreat now. Because silence does not change the outcome, she said, her voice calm. It only delays it. Adrian's expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted, a recognition, perhaps, or an understanding that reached beyond the moment itself. He leaned back slightly, considering her answer, then nodded once, slowly. Most people choose delay, he said, almost to himself, and Elena gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Most people are afraid of what happens when they speak, she replied, and Adrian looked at her again, more directly this time, as if seeing her not as someone who had interrupted a conversation, but as someone who understood something deeper about it. And you are not, he said, and it was not a question. Elena did not answer immediately, her gaze lowering briefly before returning to his. I am, she said, honestly. I just spoke anyway. The room fell quiet again, but this time it was not tension, not realization, but something closer to respect, the kind that forms not from status, but from choice. Adrian stood slowly, the movement controlled, deliberate, and as he did, the distance between them shifted, no longer defined by hierarchy, but by presence. He walked around the table, stopping a few feet from where she stood, not close enough to impose, but close enough to acknowledge. You understand something most people in this room do not, he said, his voice quieter now, more personal. That power is not always in the position, it is in the decision. Elena held his gaze, the words settling into her in a way that felt both new and familiar, because she had seen it before, in a different room, in a different life, and she nodded slightly. My father used to say that, she said, and Adrian's expression softened, just barely. He was right, he replied, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence no longer heavy, no longer tense, but steady, as if both of them understood that something had shifted, not just in the outcome of a negotiation, but in the way they now saw each other. And then Adrian turned slightly, reaching into his jacket, pulling out a simple card. No title, no company name, just a number and a name printed cleanly, precisely. He held it out to her, not as an order, not as an expectation, but as an option. If you ever find yourself in a situation where words matter, he said, call me. Elena looked at the card, then back at him, her expression thoughtful, cautious, because offers like that did not come without meaning, without consequence. But she took it anyway, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge as she accepted it. Thank you, she said quietly, and Adrian nodded once, as if that was all that needed to be said. He turned then, moving toward the door with the same calm authority he had carried all night. But just before he reached it, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. Elena, he said, and she looked up, meeting his gaze once more. Do not let anyone convince you that being overlooked makes you powerless, he added, and the words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not forced, but certain, and then he left, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Elena standing alone in the now empty room, the card still in her hand, the weight of it far greater than its size, and for the first time in a long time, she did not feel invisible, she felt seen. And that realization carried a power of its own, one she had not expected, but one she could no longer ignore. The restaurant felt different after he left, as if the air itself had shifted, quieter but not empty, carrying the echo of something that had changed and would not return to what it had been before. Elena stood there for a moment longer, the card still resting between her fingers, her mind not racing but steady, replaying the conversation not with fear, but with clarity, each word, each pause, each look, and for the first time, she was not questioning whether she should have spoken, she was understanding why she had to. A voice broke through her thoughts, sharp, controlled. What exactly do you think you were doing? Elena turned slightly to see Marcus, the floor manager, standing near the doorway, his posture rigid, his expression tight with a mixture of concern and something else, something closer to disbelief. She had seen that look before, the look people gave when someone stepped outside of the role they had assigned them. "I corrected a mistake," she replied calmly, her voice even, and Marcus let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly. "That was not your place," he said, lowering his voice as if the room itself might still be listening. "Do you understand how serious that was?" Elena nodded once. "Yes," she said, and Marcus studied her for a second, expecting hesitation, expecting uncertainty, but finding none, and that seemed to unsettle him more than anything else. "You could have lost your job," he continued. "You could have caused a problem that none of us could fix." Elena glanced briefly at the table, now empty, the contract gone, the chairs pushed back, the moment already past but still present in its impact. "Or I could have prevented one," she said quietly, and Marcus paused, the words catching somewhere between agreement and resistance, because he could not deny what had happened, but he also could not fully accept it. "Not yet. That is not how this works," he said finally, his tone softer now, less confrontational, more cautious. "People like him do not expect interference." Elena looked back at him, steady. "People like him expect accuracy," she replied, and Marcus did not respond immediately, because there was truth in that. Uncomfortable truth, the kind that shifts perspective whether you want it to or not. He exhaled slowly, running a hand along the edge of the table, as if grounding himself in something familiar. "Just be careful," he said, after a moment. And this time, the warning was not about rules, it was about consequences. Elena nodded. "I always am," she said, and Marcus gave a small, uncertain nod in return before turning and walking out, leaving her alone once more, but not in the same way as before. This time the silence felt earned, not imposed. Elena moved slowly, beginning to clear the table, her hands steady, her movements precise. But her mind remained on something else. Not the conversation, not the tension, but the card. She slipped it into the pocket of her apron, feeling its presence there, subtle but undeniable. And as she continued working, she noticed something she had not expected, the way the other staff looked at her, not openly, not directly, but differently. A glance held a second longer. A conversation paused when she walked by, not out of judgment, but out of awareness, as if they had seen something shift and were still trying to understand it. Elena did not react. She did not acknowledge it, but she felt it, the quiet change in how she was perceived, and it did not make her uncomfortable. It made her aware, because being seen was not the same as being safe. The night moved on, slowly returning to its rhythm. Guests came and went, orders were taken, glasses were filled. But beneath it all, something remained, a subtle undercurrent that had not been there before. And as the hours passed and the restaurant began to empty, Elena found herself returning to that moment again, not with doubt, but with clarity. She had recognized something. She had acted, and the outcome had changed, simple in theory, but rare in reality, because most people chose silence, most people chose safety, and she understood why. She had chosen it herself for a long time. But tonight had been different. Tonight had reminded her of something she had almost forgotten. That understanding carried responsibility, and ignoring it did not make it disappear. It only delayed what would eventually come. As the last of the guests left and the lights dimmed slightly, signaling the end of the evening, Elena stepped outside for a brief moment, the cool night air brushing against her skin, grounding, steady. The city moved around her as it always did, cars passing, distant voices, the quiet hum of life continuing without pause. She reached into her pocket, pulling out the card, turning it slightly between her fingers. There was nothing remarkable about it at first glance, no elaborate design, no indication of the weight it carried, just a name and a number, simple, direct, intentional. Elena looked at it for a moment longer, then slipped it back into her pocket, not as a decision, but as a recognition, because she knew something now that she had not known before, that her place in the world was not as fixed as she had believed, and that the line between being overlooked and being essential was thinner than most people ever realized. She turned back toward the restaurant, ready to finish her shift, but as she reached for the door, her phone buzzed softly in her apron pocket, the sound unexpected, unfamiliar. She paused, pulling it out slowly, her brow furrowing slightly as she looked at the screen, because the number that appeared was not one she recognized, and yet something about it felt intentional, deliberate, as if it had not been dialed by chance. Elena hesitated for just a second, her thumb hovering above the screen, and then she answered, her voice steady. "Hello." There was a brief pause on the other end, just long enough to carry meaning, and then a familiar voice, calm, measured, unmistakable. "Elena," Adrian said, "there is something you need to hear." Elena's fingers tightened slightly around the phone as she stepped a few inches away from the restaurant door, the cool night air brushing against her face while the city noise faded into the background. Because the voice on the other end did not belong to a casual call, it carried intention, timing, and something else she could not quite name yet. "I am listening," she said quietly, her tone steady, and there was a brief pause, not awkward, not uncertain, but deliberate, as if Adrian Russo was choosing his next words with the same precision he had used at the table. "The man who translated tonight," he said, his voice calm, controlled. He was not just inaccurate. Elena felt a subtle shift in her chest, not fear, but recognition, the confirmation of something she had already sensed but had not fully allowed herself to conclude. "I know," she replied softly, and Adrian continued. "You were correct about the wording, but that was only part of it." Elena leaned slightly against the wall beside the entrance, grounding herself, her eyes focused but distant. "What do you mean?" she asked, and Adrian's response came without hesitation. "There was a second layer," he said, "something embedded in the structure of the agreement that would not have been obvious without context." Elena's brow furrowed slightly, her mind already beginning to reconstruct the document, the phrasing, the sequence, the placement of clauses, because language was never isolated, it was always connected, always intentional. "The dispute clause," she said quietly, more to herself than to him, and there was a brief pause on the line, the kind that confirmed alignment without needing to state it. "Yes," Adrian replied, and now there was something else in his voice, not surprise, not doubt, but acknowledgement. "The selection of a neutral party," Elena continued, her thoughts moving faster now, clearer. "If they control that, then they control interpretation. And if they control interpretation, they control outcome." She stopped for a second, the realization settling fully into place. It was not just about authority, it was about enforcement. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with understanding. And then Adrian spoke again, quieter this time. "Exactly," he said, and Elena exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in clarity, because now the full shape of it was visible, not just a mistranslation, but a structure designed to shift power without appearing to do so. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked after a moment, not defensive, not suspicious, but genuinely seeking the reason. Because she understood something about people like Adrian Russo. They did not explain things without purpose. There was always intent behind the information they chose to share. Another pause, slightly longer this time, and when he spoke again, his tone had changed, just enough to matter. "Because you saw the first layer," he said. "And people who can see that do not stop there." Elena did not respond immediately, because she understood what he was implying. That recognition came with responsibility, that once you saw part of the truth, you were expected to see all of it. And that was not something she had chosen, but it was something she now carried. "And you think I should have seen it all?" she said quietly. And Adrian's answer came without hesitation. "I think you will," he replied, not as a challenge, but as a statement of belief. And that was what made it different, what made it settle differently in her chest, because it was not pressure, it was expectation, the kind that assumes capability rather than demands it. Elena looked down at the pavement for a moment, the faint reflection of streetlight catching along the surface, her thoughts steady but shifting. "Then why call me now?" she asked. And Adrian's response came immediately this time, more direct, more focused. "Because the conversation is not over," he said, and Elena felt that sentence before she fully processed it, the weight of it, the implication behind it. "What conversation?" she asked, though she already understood the answer before it came. "The one that was hidden," Adrian said. "The one that will continue without us if we do not understand it completely." Elena's grip on the phone tightened slightly, not from fear, but from awareness. because she understood something now that she had not fully considered before, that what happened in that room was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something else, something that extended beyond a single document, beyond a single meeting, into something larger, more complex, more deliberate. "What do you need from me?" she asked, and this time, there was no hesitation in her voice. No uncertainty, just clarity, and Adrian's answer came just as steady. "Your perspective," he said, not as a waitress, not as someone who happened to be there, but as someone who understands what others overlook. Elena closed her eyes briefly, not to escape, but to center herself, because she recognized that moment, the one where a choice presents itself again, different in form but the same in essence: speak or remain silent, step forward or step back, and she already knew which one she would choose. "Then tell me everything," she said, her voice calm, firm, and on the other end of the line, there was no pause this time, no hesitation, just a quiet acknowledgement that sounded almost like approval. And then Adrian spoke again. "Good," he said, "because this time, we listen carefully." The line remained quiet for a moment after Adrian spoke, not empty, not uncertain, but focused, as if both of them understood that what came next required more than attention. It required precision. Elena shifted slightly where she stood, the cool air brushing against her skin, grounding her as her mind moved quickly through everything she had already heard, everything she had already seen, and more importantly, everything that had not been said yet. "Start from the beginning," she said, her voice calm, steady, and Adrian did not question it. He did not redirect. He simply responded. "The agreement tonight was only one piece," he said. "A visible one, designed to appear complete." Elena closed her eyes briefly, visualizing the structure of the document again, the flow, the placement, the intentional rhythm of clauses that guided interpretation without drawing attention to themselves. "So there are others," she said, not as a question, but as a conclusion, and Adrian confirmed it. Immediately, "Yes," he said, "separate agreements, separate negotiations, all structured differently but aligned in outcome." Elena exhaled slowly, the realization settling deeper now. This was not an isolated incident. It was a system, a pattern, something designed to operate across multiple conversations without revealing itself in any single one. "And the translator," she said, her voice quieter now, more focused, "he was part of that structure." Adrian did not hesitate. "He was placed there intentionally," he said. "Not to mislead, obviously, but to guide interpretation subtly." Elena opened her eyes, her gaze sharpening as the pieces began to connect more clearly. "Then the wording is not random," she said. "It is coordinated," and Adrian's response carried a note of certainty. "Exactly," he said. "Each agreement reinforces the others, even if the language appears unrelated." Elena felt a subtle shift in her chest, not fear, but recognition, because this was no longer about correcting a single mistake. It was about understanding a design. "Then we are not looking at a negotiation," she said slowly. "We are looking at a framework." The words settled between them, precise, accurate, and Adrian repeated it quietly. "A framework," as if confirming it for himself as well. Elena stepped slightly away from the wall, her posture straightening, her focus sharpening, because now the question was not what had happened, but what it meant. "What do they gain if all of this holds?" she asked, and Adrian answered without hesitation. "Control without confrontation," he said. "Authority without visibility." Elena nodded slowly, because that made sense. It aligned with everything she had seen, everything she had heard. "And if no one notices," she continued, "then it becomes permanent." Adrian's voice lowered slightly. "That is the intention," he said, and the weight of that settled into the space between them, not dramatically, not loudly, but with quiet certainty. Elena remained silent for a moment, her mind moving through the implications, the layers, the consequences that extended beyond a single agreement, beyond a single room. "Then there has to be a pattern in the language," she said finally, and Adrian's response came immediately. "There is," he said, "but it is not obvious." Elena's gaze shifted slightly, as if she were looking at something that was not physically there, but fully present in her mind. "It would not be," she said. "If it were obvious, it would not work." Adrian allowed a brief pause. as if acknowledging the accuracy of that statement. "That is why I called you," he said, and Elena felt that again, that subtle shift. Not pressure, not expectation, but recognition, because he was not asking her to confirm what he already knew. He was asking her to see what he had not yet seen. "What do you have?" she asked, her voice steady, focused, and Adrian did not hesitate. "I will send you the documents," he said. "All of them." Elena's fingers tightened slightly around the phone, not from uncertainty, but from understanding, because this was no longer a moment. It was a responsibility. "And you want me to review them?" she said, and Adrian's answer came without pause. "I want you to listen to them," he said, "the way you listened tonight." Elena let that settle for a second, because it was not just about reading. It was about perception, about recognizing what was hidden beneath what appeared correct. "Then I will need context," she said. "Not just the documents, but where they came from, who was involved, what was said before and after." Adrian's voice carried a slight shift, something that sounded almost like approval. "You will have it," he said. "Everything you need." Elena nodded once, even though he could not see it. "Then send it," she replied, her tone firm, clear, and there was no hesitation on the other end this time. No pause, just a quiet acknowledgement that carried weight. "I will," Adrian said, and then, after a brief moment, he added, "Elena." She responded immediately, "Yes." And his next words were quieter, more deliberate. "What you noticed tonight was not accidental," he said. "And neither is this." Elena did not answer right away, because she understood what he meant, that this was not coincidence, that her ability to see what others overlooked had a place, a purpose, whether she had chosen it or not. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, certain. "I know," she said. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence not empty, but aligned. And then Adrian ended the call, not abruptly, not casually, but with the same quiet precision he carried in everything he did. And Elena lowered the phone slowly, her reflection faint in the glass door beside her, the city still moving around her, unchanged, unaware, but she knew something now that most people did not, that beneath the surface of ordinary conversations, there were structures, patterns, intentions, and once you learned to see them, you could not unsee them, and more importantly, you could not ignore them. She slipped the phone back into her pocket, her mind already shifting toward what was coming next, because whatever this was, it was no longer just about a mistake corrected in a single moment. It was about something larger, something unfolding, and she had already stepped into it. The message arrived less than 3 minutes after the call ended, not with a notification that demanded attention, but with a quiet precision that mirrored the man who sent it. Elena felt her phone vibrate once in her pocket as she stepped back inside the restaurant, the door closing softly behind her, sealing her off from the night air and returning her to the controlled rhythm of the space. But something had changed, not in the room, not in the people, but in her awareness of it. She reached into her apron and pulled out her phone, her gaze steady as she opened the message, a single secure link, no explanation, no instructions, just access, direct and intentional. Elena stood still for a moment, her thumb hovering over the screen, not out of hesitation, but out of understanding, because once she opened it, she would not be looking at a simple document. She would be stepping into the structure Adrian had described, and structures like that did not exist without purpose. She tapped the link, and the screen shifted instantly, revealing a series of files, organized, labeled, but not in a way that made them easy to interpret. They were separated by date, by region, by parties involved, but there was no obvious connection between them, at least not on the surface. Elena's eyes moved slowly across the list, not scanning, not rushing, but observing. Because she knew that patterns did not reveal themselves to those who looked quickly, they revealed themselves to those who listened carefully. She selected the first file, her fingers steady, and as the document opened, her expression did not change, but her focus sharpened. The language was clean, professional, structured in a way that would appear standard to anyone unfamiliar with its nuances. But she had already learned that what appeared standard was often where the deviation began. Her eyes moved line by line, not reading in the conventional sense, but analyzing, feeling the rhythm of the sentences, the placement of words, the subtle shifts in tone that indicated intention rather than error, and then she saw it. Not immediately, not obviously, but gradually, like a shape forming beneath the surface, a phrase that appeared neutral, but carried a secondary meaning when placed within the context of the clause that followed it. Elena's breathing remained steady, but her mind moved faster now, connecting that phrase to something Adrian had mentioned, the reinforcement between agreements. She exited the file and opened another. This one from a different region, different parties, different language structure, but the pattern was there again, not identical, but aligned. The same shift in authority disguised as a variation in wording, the same structure hidden beneath a different surface. Elena leaned slightly against the counter, her posture relaxed, but her focus absolute, because now she was not just looking at individual documents. She was seeing the framework, the design that connected them. She opened a third file, then a fourth, her movements precise, deliberate, and with each one, the pattern became clearer, not simpler, but more defined. Each agreement carried its own variation, its own unique phrasing, but the outcome was always the same. Control shifted quietly, gradually, without drawing attention, until it became the default. Elena exhaled slowly, not in surprise, but in confirmation, because this was not accidental. It was constructed, intentionally, carefully, over time. Her phone vibrated again, a new message, this time a single line, Adrian's name. Appearing above it, she opened it immediately. "What do you see?" he had written. Elena did not respond right away, not because she did not know the answer, but because she understood that the way she explained it mattered as much as what she saw. She glanced back at the documents, at the structure that had begun to reveal itself, and then she typed, her words measured, precise. "It is not just a pattern in language," she wrote. "It is a pattern in outcome. Each agreement is designed to appear independent, but they all lead to the same point." She paused for a fraction of a second, then added, "Centralized control through decentralized structure." She sent the message and waited, not impatiently, not uncertainly, but with the calm of someone who understood the weight of what she had just said. A few seconds passed. Then her phone vibrated again, Adrian's response appearing almost immediately. "Yes," he wrote, just one word, but it carried confirmation, alignment, and something else. Something that felt like acknowledgement. Elena's gaze remained on the screen, but her thoughts moved beyond it, because now the question was not whether the structure existed, it was what it was meant to achieve, and more importantly, who was behind it. Her fingers hovered over the screen again, then moved, deliberate, steady. "Then the question is not how it works," she typed. "It is who benefits when it does." She sent the message, and this time, the pause that followed was longer, not uncertain, but thoughtful, as if Adrian was considering not the answer, but how much of it to reveal. Elena remained still, her posture unchanged, her focus steady, and then the response came, not immediate, not delayed, but intentional. "That," Adrian wrote, "is what we find next." Elena read the words once, then again, letting them settle, because she understood what they meant, that this was no longer analysis, it was direction, and she had already stepped into it. She locked her phone slowly, slipping it back into her apron, the weight of it now different, not heavier, but more defined. She glanced around the restaurant, the familiar space now carrying a different significance, because she was no longer just moving through it, she was seeing beyond it. And as she picked up a glass from the counter, her movements steady, controlled, she understood something with quiet certainty, that what had started as a single correction had become something else entirely, something that extended beyond her role, beyond the room, into something larger, and whether she had intended it or not, she was now part of it. The restaurant had nearly emptied by the time Elena finished reviewing the last of the files, the soft hum of refrigeration units and distant clinking of glassware replacing the earlier conversations. But her focus had not drifted, not even slightly, because once the pattern revealed itself, it demanded to be followed to its source. She stood behind the counter now, her phone resting flat in her palm, the screen dark, but the information still vivid in her mind. Each clause, each variation, each carefully disguised shift in authority aligning into something that was no longer abstract. It was intentional, constructed, and most importantly, directed. Her phone vibrated again, subtle, controlled, and she unlocked it immediately. Adrian's message appearing without delay. There is one more file, he wrote, and beneath it, a second link. Separate from the others, not grouped, not categorized. Elena felt a slight tightening in her chest. Not fear, but recognition. Because something separated from a pattern was either irrelevant or essential, and nothing Adrian sent was ever irrelevant. She opened it without hesitation, and this time, the document that appeared was different, not in format, not in structure, but in tone. The language was more precise, more deliberate, as if this one had not been designed to blend in, but to anchor everything else. Elena's eyes moved carefully across the text, slower than before, more attentive to each word, each placement, because this was not another variation. This was the center point, the one that defined the others, and as she read, she began to understand why. The clauses were not just structured to shift control, they were structured to validate each other, to create a loop of authority that reinforced itself across separate agreements, making it nearly impossible to challenge without unraveling the entire system. Elena exhaled slowly, her gaze sharpening, because now the design was complete, not just a framework, but a closed system, and that changed everything. Her fingers hovered above the screen for a moment, then moved, deliberate, steady. This is not just coordination, she typed. It is consolidation. She sent the message and waited, not long, because Adrian's response came almost immediately. Explain, he wrote, and Elena's expression remained calm, but her thoughts moved with precision. Each agreement feeds into the next, she typed. They are not separate, they are dependent. If one is accepted, it validates the others, and once enough are in place, the system cannot be challenged without invalidating all of them. She paused briefly, then added, it creates the illusion of agreement while removing the ability to disagree. She sent the message, and this time the pause was longer, not uncertain, but measured, as if Adrian was considering not just what she said, but what it meant for everything that followed. Elena remained still, her posture steady, her breathing even, and when the response came, it carried more than acknowledgement. Yes, Adrian wrote, and now you see why it matters. Elena read the words once, then again, because she understood what he was saying without needing him to elaborate, that this was no longer about preventing a single agreement. It was about preventing a system from completing itself. Her fingers moved. Again, then stopping one is not enough, she typed, and Adrian's reply came without delay. No, he wrote. It is not. Elena's gaze shifted slightly, her focus deepening. Then we need to identify the origin, she continued. The point where all of this connects. The one place where control is not distributed, but centralized. She sent the message, and this time, the silence that followed was different, heavier, not because the answer was unclear, but because it was known, and when Adrian responded, his words were fewer, but more deliberate. We already have, he wrote. Elena felt that sentence before she fully processed it, the weight of it, the implication behind it. Then why send this to me? She asked, her voice steady even in text, and Adrian's response came slower this time, not hesitant, but intentional. Because I needed to know if you would see it. He wrote. Elena's expression did not change, but something in her chest shifted, not surprise, but understanding, because this had not just been about information, it had been about confirmation. Her fingers moved again. And now that I have, she typed, and Adrian's reply came immediately. Now we move forward. Elena lowered the phone slightly, her reflection faint in the glass behind the counter, the restaurant quiet around her, but her mind clear, focused, aligned, because she understood what that meant, that this was no longer observation, it was involvement, not passive, not optional, but chosen. And as she stood there, the weight of it did not feel overwhelming, it felt defined, because clarity does that. It removes uncertainty and replaces it with direction. Her phone remained in her hand, but she did not look at it again immediately. She looked instead at the space around her, the familiar environment that now felt different, not because it had changed, but because she had, and after a moment, she lifted the phone again, her fingers steady as she typed one final message, not long, not complicated, just clear. Tell me where to begin, she sent it. And this time, the response came with no delay at all, as if it had already been waiting. Tomorrow, Adrian wrote. We meet. and Elena read the word once, letting it settle, because she understood something now that she had not before, that the line she had crossed was not behind her, it was ahead of her, and this time, she was not stepping into it by accident. She was walking toward it with intention. The night ended quietly, but the silence that followed Elena home was not empty. It was filled with something steady, something that did not fade when the lights dimmed or the doors closed. She sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment, the city lights filtering through the window, casting soft reflections across the surface, her phone resting in front of her, screen dark, but the message still clear in her mind. Tomorrow we meet. Simple words, but they carried direction, and direction changed everything. Elena did not rush to sleep. She did not distract herself. She let her mind move through what she had seen, not replaying it as a moment, but reconstructing it as a system, each document, each clause, each subtle shift in meaning aligning into something that was no longer theoretical. It was real, structured, deliberate. She stood slowly, moving toward the window, her reflection faint against the glass. And for a moment, she saw two versions of herself layered together. The one who had spent years learning to remain unnoticed, and the one who had stepped forward without permission, without certainty, and spoken anyway. The difference between them was not ability, it was decision, and that realization settled deeper than anything else, because it meant that what had changed was not her skill, it was her willingness to use it. Her phone vibrated softly, pulling her attention back, a message, not from Adrian, but from an unknown number. She unlocked the screen, her gaze steady as she read. A short message, direct. Be careful who you trust. No signature, no context, just the words. Elena did not react immediately. She did not feel alarm. She felt recognition, because systems like the one she had just uncovered did not exist without awareness, and awareness did not remain contained. Someone knew, or at least suspected, and that meant the situation was already larger than it appeared. She set the phone down gently, her expression calm, not because the message was insignificant, but because it confirmed what she had already understood, that once you saw the pattern, you became part of it, whether you intended to or not. She returned to the table, sitting slowly, her posture relaxed but her focus sharp, and for the first time since the call, she allowed herself to consider the question she had not yet asked, not what the system was, not how it worked, but why it had been allowed to exist, because structures like that did not build themselves. They were supported, enabled, protected, and that meant the answer she was looking for was not just a person, it was a network. Her phone remained still for a few seconds, then vibrated again, this time with a message she recognized, Adrian's name appearing at the top. She opened it. Immediately. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock, he wrote, followed by an address. No explanation, no detail, just location, precise, intentional. Elena read it once, committing it to memory, then locked her phone again, not because she was done, but because she already understood what was expected. Preparation did not mean gathering information. She already had that. It meant clarity, and clarity came from understanding what mattered most. She stood again, moving through her apartment with quiet purpose, not rushing, not hesitating, simply aligning herself with what was coming next. The night passed without interruption, but sleep came differently, not restless, not uneasy, but focused, as if her mind had accepted the direction and settled into it. Morning arrived with soft light filtering through the window, the city already in motion. Elena moved through her routine with the same calm precision she had carried the night before. No deviation, no distraction, but there was a difference, subtle, but present. She was no longer moving through the day by habit. She was moving through it with intention. When she stepped outside, the air felt sharper, clearer, not because it had changed, but because her awareness of it had. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing lightly against the card Adrian had given her. Still there, still simple, still carrying more weight than it appeared to. She did not take it out. She did not need to. She already knew what it represented, a connection, a choice, a direction she had already begun to follow. The address he had sent was not far, but she did not rush. She walked steadily, her pace even, her focus clear. The city moved around her, unchanged, unaware, but she understood something now that most people did not, that beneath the surface of ordinary movement, there were patterns, structures, decisions being made that shaped outcomes long before they became visible, and she was walking toward one of them. When she reached the building, she stopped for a brief moment, not out of hesitation, but out of acknowledgement, because this was not just a meeting, it was a continuation. She stepped inside, the door closing softly behind her, and as she moved forward, her posture remained steady, her expression calm, because whatever waited beyond that moment, she would not meet it as someone who had been overlooked. She would meet it as someone who had chosen to see. The building was quiet in a way that did not feel empty, but intentional, as if every sound had been measured and reduced to only what was necessary. Elena moved through the lobby with steady steps, her reflection briefly catching in the polished glass walls, not as someone uncertain, but as someone aware of where she was and why she was there. The elevator doors opened without delay, as if expected, and when she stepped inside, there were no buttons to press, only a soft hum as it began to rise, smooth, controlled, and in that moment, she understood something without needing to be told. This meeting had been prepared long before she arrived. The doors opened onto a floor that felt less like an office and more like a space designed for clarity, minimal, precise, nothing unnecessary. Adrian Russo stood near the far window, his back partially turned, the city stretching out behind him in quiet motion, and when he turned, his expression was the same as it had been the night before, composed, attentive, but now there was something else beneath it, something steadier, something that acknowledged what had already been established between them. "You came," he said, not as a question, but as recognition. Elena nodded once, stepping forward into the room, her posture relaxed but her focus sharp. "You said we would meet," she replied, and Adrian inclined his head slightly, as if confirming that was enough. He gestured toward the table nearby, where several documents rested, printed, organized, but not explained, and Elena understood immediately. This was not about being told what to see. It was about seeing it herself. She approached the table, her gaze moving across the pages, familiar structures, familiar patterns, but now placed together, not separated, not disguised, and that changed how they were read. Adrian remained where he was for a moment, watching, not interrupting, not directing, allowing her to move through it at her own pace, because he understood something she did as well. That recognition could not be forced, it had to be reached. Elena picked up the first document, her fingers steady, her eyes scanning not for surface meaning, but for alignment, and as she moved to the second, then the third, she saw it clearly now, not just the pattern, but the center, the point where everything converged. She set the paper down slowly, her gaze lifting to meet Adrian's. "It is not just a network," she said, her voice calm, precise. "It is controlled from a single interpretation point." Adrian nodded once, not surprised, not impressed, but acknowledging that she had reached the same conclusion he had. "Yes," he said, and then, after a brief pause, he added, "And that point is not visible to anyone who does not know where to look." Elena's expression remained steady, but her understanding deepened, because now the question was not what the system did, but how it remained hidden. "It relies on trust," she said, "on the assumption that what is presented is accurate." Adrian stepped closer to the table, not imposing, but present, and on the fact that most people do not question what appears correct, he replied. Elena nodded slightly, because that was the truth of it, not complexity, not secrecy, but simplicity used in a way that discouraged examination. She glanced back at the documents, then at him. "Then the system does not fail because it is challenged," she said. "It fails when it is understood." Adrian's gaze held hers, steady, direct, and for the first time since she had entered the room, there was something in his expression that resembled agreement without reservation. "Exactly," he said quietly, and the words settled between them with clarity. Elena took a slow breath, not from pressure, but from recognition, because she understood now what this moment represented, not the end of a process, but the beginning of a decision. Adrian reached for one of the documents, sliding it slightly toward her. "This is where it connects," he said, his tone even, and Elena looked down at the page, her eyes moving carefully across the text, and then she saw it, not hidden, not obscured, but placed in a way that required understanding to recognize, a clause that defined authority not by position, but by interpretation. and once she saw it, she could not unsee it. She looked up again, meeting his gaze. "This is the anchor," she said, and Adrian nodded once more. "Yes," he replied, and then he added, more quietly, "And now you know why it matters who reads it." The room fell still, not with tension, not with uncertainty, but with clarity, the kind that removes doubt and replaces it with direction. Elena held his gaze for a moment longer, then glanced back at the document, her mind no longer searching, but understanding, because the pattern was complete now, the structure revealed, the purpose clear, and with that clarity came something else, not obligation, not expectation, but choice. She set the paper down gently, her posture steady, her voice calm. "Then it changes with the person who sees it," she said, and Adrian's response came without hesitation. "Yes," he said, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, because nothing more needed to be said. The truth had already settled into place, and in that silence, something shifted, not in the room, not in the documents, but in how they were understood, because power had moved, quietly, from assumption to awareness. Elena stepped back slightly, not retreating, but acknowledging the space between them, the balance that had formed, and Adrian watched her, not as someone above or below him, but as someone who now stood within the same understanding. "What happens next?" she asked, and Adrian did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because the answer was not his alone to give. He looked at her for a moment, then said, simply, "That depends on what you choose to do with what you know." The words settled, not heavy, not forced, but real, and Elena did not look away. She did not hesitate, because she had already made that decision the moment she chose to speak. And as the city moved beyond the glass behind them, unchanged and unaware, something within that room had already shifted permanently, because truth, once seen, does not return to silence. And that day, without raising her voice, without asking for permission, Elena Carter had changed the outcome of something far larger than a single conversation, and Adrian Russo, for the first time in a long time, did not look at her as someone who had interrupted his world. He looked at her as someone who had revealed it. And in that moment, the room went still, not from tension, but from understanding, because that day, the balance of power had not been taken, it had been recognized, and that is something no one can take away.